So this is the conclusion to the dog crate build. I thought this was actually going to be a fairly short video, but it turns out I had more footage at the end of this than I thought I did, just because mounting all the specialized hardware for this sort of project takes some time. So obviously that translates into time in the video as well. But where we left off, I didn't have much as far as fabrication for the crate left to do, so most of this video is going to be just finishing up those little bits and pieces, mounting all the hardware, the locks and everything for it, and then also applying finish. Like I've said in past videos, I made this over a month ago, so it's no longer in my shop, but I do have finished photos of this. That will be at the end of the video, and then next week will be footage of installing the built-in, and then it's on to the next project. So we're going to start off by working on the base. The base is going to be 1/2-inch plywood, and I'm going to be putting some slats underneath of it just to add some structure to it, even though the 1/2-inch was probably enough. For stuff like this, I like to use scraps I have around the shop, so I had some about 3-inch by 3/4-inch poplar from an other project laying around the shop, which is why it's all marked up, and I used that supplemented with some 1x4 furring strips in order to get some slats across the bottom. And then I could cut down some plywood. I was working on a built-in at the time I was working on this, so I had some 1/2-inch ply laying around, but I didn't have enough to do the whole base in one piece, and it wasn't worth buying a whole sheet of 1/2-inch ply, especially since it's so expensive nowadays to buy these sheet goods. So I just cut up some pieces I had laying around, and I could fit the base. So you kind of see how everything fits. I could put a bigger piece in there, take some measurements to the front, and then cut the smaller piece. As you could see, my cabinet's square because I had about 8 inches left after putting that back piece in. If your cabinet's not square, honestly on something like this, it's not a huge deal if it's off a little bit. You just might have to either have an uneven base or cut it on a taper so it fits. But mine was the same measurements. You could see I just put that in place, and now this base fits nicely, so it's level with the front. It also, I don't know if I got good footage of it, but the base now holds that back bit of beadboard in place. It goes up against it, there I'm showing that, so now that beadboard's held in place. For the top, I took some measurements. I wanted it about 1 inch wider all around. These are the last 2 planks I have left over from those joists, so I just cut them down into roughly 45-inch pieces, and then I'm going to start jointing the edges. Now, like I said before, this lumber was actually really nice lumber. It's not cupped or twisted because it is older lumber, so I was able to just rip off the sides and make it square. If you're using newer lumber that you've let sit around, you might not be able to do this safely, but you can see that this lumber is pretty flat. So all I did was rip off one side, move my fence a little bit, and rip off the other side, and that's how I went about jointing this lumber, because I don't have a jointer, and it ended up working out fairly nicely. So with my 4 slats, I'm going to cut these in half. That left this a little bit thinner than 3/4 of an inch, which is on a little bit on the thin side for a top, but this isn't a tabletop. There's not going to be a lot of weight going on it, so it worked out for myself. And you could see all I'm doing is I'm going to just cut these 2x6's in half. With cuts like this, I like to do it gradually, so I went about, the blade goes up 3 inches, so I usually do about 1.5 inches, and then I raise it to 3. So I'm passing this through on one side and the other side so that I could get it to that, it's about 5.5 inches I need, but I don't do that whole 3 inches at once, especially with wood that has lots of knots in it. Even though this is a 3 horsepower saw, sometimes it overpowers the saw, so I go through it in increments in order to get those cuts, and then you could see these are the planks I'm left with. So once that was done, all I did was send it through the planer just to clean it up on the one side, because I have a little bit of an uneven cut towards the end, which will happen with lumber that you don't pre-joint. So this is the kit I got. I didn't dislike this kit. There aren't a lot of options for it, but they sent me some pieces I didn't need, which ended up working out because they sent me not enough pieces for the bit. So this is a 2-door kit, but it only came with one one piece for the bottom to hold the doors in place, one piece for the track. So I ended up using those other metal pieces in place of the fact that they only sent one for the track. So you can see I pre-measured on the top here where that line should be, because they recommend this going about 2.5 inches down from the top. I just laid it on there, marked my holes. These are slotted holes, so there is a little play that you have in mounting this bar hardware. And then I could go through and just pre-drill some holes and attach those with the lags they give you. Now this kit worked out just about perfectly for the opening I had, but you can buy 2 kits and get a longer run if you want to. Like I said, I did not dislike this kit, but there were some pieces missing. You see, it's pretty simple. I could just pre-drill those holes and then attach those lag bolts. And then I have the top. I'm using the top to make sure that the hardware fits, and it does. So all of that math was worth it. So then like I said, I'm jumping around quite a bit in this. So for this, I'm going to be mounting the interior portion that will separate the 2 sides of the crate so that you could fit 2 dogs in. I'm using newer lumber for this. So instead of leaving it a rough 2x4, I'm just cleaning it up by ripping down the sides a little bit, just so it looks a little bit nicer. It doesn't have that rough 2x4 edge. This is going on the inside. You won't really see it anyways, but I wanted to clean it up a little bit. So the top one's going to be a little bit longer than the bottom, because that front rail obviously is set back further than the bottom. So you can see that one's longer. This one's going on the bottom. I'm mounting this roughly in the center, and then the one on the top. So I'm just basically going to be putting 2 dados in these pieces, and then my wire can slide in between the 2. I can screw those to the top and the bottom, and that's how we'll separate the cage. For the wire I got, this is actually used to make an exterior dog crate outside. This is what it looks like. I was originally going to get thicker gauge wire, but it was cheaper to get this, and it was enough material to make the center portion as well as the wire for the doors. So that's what I ended up buying. It's also thicker gauge wire, so I don't have to worry about the dogs being able to break through at any point, but you do need some pretty heavy duty snips in order to get through it. So there is an indentation at the top and the bottom. You could see it on the panel. So I'm going to be using that for the interior part because it won't really matter. And then I want the flat surface for the door material. And I did a rough measurement of what that was going to be, because you could see the 2 dados I cut. I marked where those dados were, and then that is the measurement I had height-wise. My dado ended up being not deep enough, so I went through and cut those deep again. I believe this was a 1/4 inch dado I put in here, and then I could test fit this panel in there. Now because of the rail in the front, you could see I have to cut a little bit of a square out of the top so that it fits in there nicely. But I have big bolt cutters for this, so it was very easy to go through this stuff, and that's basically how that's going to fit in place inside. The nice thing about this is if you ever want to turn it into a 1-dog crate, you could easily remove this center panel. It's also coated, so you don't have to worry about sharp edges or anything like that. Now you can see it's a little proud sticking out the front. I do end up snipping that down at the end. I can't remember if I film it. So then they give you rough measurements for the doors. You want to make sure you leave a 1/2 inch space at the bottom, all that sort of stuff, and then a 3/4 inch mounting for the doors. So the easiest way I found to do that was I marked where they want the door to come up to on the hardware. I put the hardware in place, I got that measurement, and I subtracted a 1/2 inch from it. Now in this you could see I'm going past center, which was 21 inches. This is moving a little bit quickly. That was not going to end up being enough. You'll see later in the video how I should have went further, but they don't really give you calculations in the instructions for how to calculate the overlap on the doors. But I cut enough material when I cut those 2x6's in half to get the door material, which is what I'm using. Once again, this is about 3/4 inch thick. Cutting it down, I believe, to 2.5 inch strips, and that was based mostly on the material I had to use. I was running out of those 2x6's at this point. So then I could rough cut these down to size. Like I said, I'm going 21 inches wide, and then I'm putting a groove just like I do for all of the doors. That's where the groove's going to be, and then that will be the measurement for the upper rail. So the groove, since it's going to be the same material, is about 1/4 of an inch. It ends up being a little bit thicker than that, but you'll see I'll make some adjustments. I could cut to the one side of this cut a little bit to the right of middle, and then I could just flip it around and cut it again, and that will give me a centered groove. So I'm testing that cut. I'm going to the wire to see if it will fit. It didn't, and then I'm just moving the fence slightly and then testing that cut again. Now when you're making these thin cuts like this, you'll see I'll test cut on a new piece. A lot of times when you make small incremental changes to the fence, the blade will sometimes ride on the inside of the groove, and it will give you an inaccurate cut. So I made a second test cut on a new piece. It was right, and then I could send all of those pieces through. So this is the tenon I'm left with at the edge. It looks fairly thin, but you could see pressing it on the table, it's sturdy enough, and these doors aren't going to have a lot of stress put on them because they're mounted from the top. So that's how I'm attaching all of the doors, is with these little tenons into my grooves. So I set that up on the radial arm saw. You could see there's a stop there for the correct depth, and then I raise the blade. I always do test cuts with these, and then I could just cut all of those tongues at once. This is my preferred method to do it. The top, flip it over and cut the bottom, and then they all come out fairly accurate, even though this is dimensional lumber and I didn't joint or plane it severely, so it's all the same, but usually this stuff comes out pretty nicely. So switching gears back to the tabletop, I glued this together. I didn't show gluing it up with the panel, but you could see essentially how I have all that clamped in place. And then this is the top. The bottom actually is pretty clean, but I'm using the top so it matches the outside look of the crate a little bit better. This glued up quite nicely, but there was some undulations in it, so I do use the belt sander to knock down that a little bit and remove that gray, so I'm left with this nice brown look on the top, and everything came out fairly flat at this point. And then I could go through with the circular saw and cut it down to size. I just even up one edge, and then once that edge is even, I could use the tape measure to calculate on the other side, cut everything down. You could see that there is some waviness in these boards. They're not perfect. On the edge there, you could see that they're not perfectly flat. That's the lumber, not necessarily how I glued it up. Could trim it down to size. It was really only about an inch oversized. Fit it on the top, and then that's basically what that's going to look like. Very simple top. I'll put a chamfer on the edges, but that will be it. My hardware fits under there nicely. So these are the back to the doors. That's the dry fit for the doors. And then that inner panel, I just measure. I think I ended up with an inch extra was the groove, so I can measure the inside frame and then add the depth of the groove onto that, and then that's the calculations for the wire. So for this one, I'm cutting it a little uneven so that it's symmetrical. You could see that there's the horizontals going through the wire. I wanted them to be the same on each piece, so that's why I'm making multiple cuts. But like I said, this stuff's pretty easy to cut down, and then I could just fit that wire in place inside the doors. And then test fit them in place. So then gluing these up, fairly simple. I'm putting glue on all of the tenons. And then I could just hammer it back together, measure my diagonals to make sure that the door is square, and then I'll just put some clamps on it and hold everything in place. So obviously the front is going to be the rougher sawn lumber just to match the outside. It leaves it a little bit of a nicer hue. So then to finish up the base, I'm cutting some slats similar to how you would attach bed slats. So these are smaller pieces of lumber I'm putting on the ledge just to kind of shore everything up. This isn't totally necessary, but I wanted to hold all these slats in place pretty easily without having to screw them in place. So I could just go through and put the slats in there with some glue, and then I'll put a couple brads in there to hold them in place as the glue dries, and then that really shores up the base. It also adds a little bit of structure to all the dados and stuff I cut out of that bottom rail. So then I'm going to trace where this bottom piece is going. I'm going to drill through to the bottom, and then I could, this is just a countersinking bit, so I could drill through to the bottom, lift up the base, and then screw this in from the bottom, which will shore that up as well. So like I said, you see where those holes are because I drilled through. And then I could put everything in place, and that's how I attach that bottom piece. There's no hardware or anything to worry about the dogs getting snagged on or cut on, because it's all in the bottom piece. And then that's snugly in place. I could add the wire. And then for the top part, I'm just going to toe in the screws into the front and the back. You could use pocket hole screws for this, but I find it's just as easy to drill a 45-degree hole, countersink it, and then I could attach the screws that way. I do them on opposite sides just for a little bit more, just to get it a little sturdier, and then that's done as well. So then for the doors, they're going to ride essentially in that track, which is the piece that's missing. So you cut about a 1/4 inch groove on the bottom. This is just so the doors don't flop out when you're sliding them. They have to ride in some sort of track. So I'm doing that to both doors. Like I said, this is just one cut, 1/8 inch cut, and then I cut it off center on the one, and then I change the blade and cut through the middle. Though like I said, this is how the doors are mounted. They didn't really give great instructions for how much overlay you need, which is where I kind of ran into trouble. You can see I have it mocked up. My doors are about 1 inch shy of mounting from the edge. So I thought overlapping as much as I did would be enough. It was not. So originally I was just going to add a stop on either edge, but what I decided to do, which I'll show in the video, is I just added an extra piece to the edge of the doors, which ended up working a little bit easier. Then I can go through and mount this hardware. I'm mounting it towards the edges like this to help with how much space I needed on the doors, which is why they're so close to the edge. If you want to do this, I recommend overlapping your doors much more than I did, which was I was past middle with these, about 1 inch past middle, but it was still, I needed more. So this is the part that was missing, the track on the bottom, but they gave me, I forget what these metal pieces were actually for in the instructions, but I didn't need them for my design. So I decided to just repurpose them for the track on the bottom. It ended up working out better because the track they supply you with was plastic and these are metal. So you can see I just mount the doors. I use a level to get them level. There are slotted holes in this you could kind of play around with. I pre-drilled and then I drilled them in place, but you can move them back and forth, which was nice. And then you could see with that in place, you can't move these in or out. They're held in place like that. I could do the same thing for the one in the front, line it up, attach them, and if I needed to, I can move them back and forth. So this ended up working out. Like I said, I forget exactly what these pieces were for, but I didn't need them for my design. In order to attach the top, I'm using figure 8s. You could see you just countersink a little bit on the edge, and they allowed for seasonal movement of the top. And then I just chamfer the edges. At this point, I'm working on multiple things in the shop, so I was running out of space. The heater I'm cutting this on top of is obviously not on. And then from the figure 8s on the inside, you could attach I had put 4 3/4 inch screws, and that was just enough. Like I said, since this is a dog crate, not necessarily utilitarian piece of furniture where the top will get used a lot more, or more so than just decorative pieces on the top. Didn't go crazy with how it was attached. This is the piece I added to the edge of the doors in order to make them wide enough for my purposes. And then I put locks on the bottoms. This is the hardware I chose because I thought it matched the style of the crate. It's pretty simple. There's 2 mounting pieces. I put them on top of the seam that I added just to kind of hide it a little bit. Even though once the finish went on, it matched quite well. There's a hole in the bottom, and then you could move the locking mechanism and then just attach it from the top. Pretty self-explanatory. Once it's in place, I marked where that lock will go into place. And then I just drilled some holes, and then they give you a metal bracket for the bottom to cover the drilled hole, and everything went into place. Now for the outside of this, the customer originally wanted it stained, and I kind of clear coated it without asking because I thought it would look nicer. You usually don't do that, but I've made stuff for him before, and he's very easygoing. So this is getting 2 coats of Osmo Oil. I chose this because it's food grade safe, which means it's safe for pets as well. And I just love the way it looks. It really brings out the richness of the wood. It's very easy to apply. It's one of my favorite finishes at this point. Apply it with a white pad. I really rub it into place, and you use it, rub it into the wood, and you use it sparingly. You don't want to overdo it. Put on 2 coats. I lightly burnish it in between with a fresh pad, and then this is the second coat. Goes on, and it dries really nicely. You could see it really brings out the richness, the hues in all of the pieces. I like that it's food grade safe, and it's a natural oil, so there's not a lot of abrasive chemicals in it as well. I did this to the whole piece, obviously, and that was the finish. So you get a nice little change in tones with the beadboard as well, without staining it, and the natural look of that lumber. Usually pine is not super pretty in layman's terms today, but this older pine really has a nice finish to it. This is basically what it looks like reassembled. I obviously take all the hardware off to put the finish on. It's just easier that way.